Chapter 1. The unused room. When Inspector Hale brought the matter to me, he described it as trivial. That, in itself, did not impress me. Many matters of the first importance present themselves at first as trifles, while many things loudly announced as terrible and extraordinary are, upon examination, nothing more than vanity in good clothes. Hale, who was a sensible man within the limits of his profession, had the useful police habit of distrusting drama and the less useful habit of undervaluing nuance. He preferred a case to begin with a body, a broken lock, or a signed statement. A gentleman seen in a room at the wrong hour seemed to him the sort of nonsense by which servants excite one another, and old houses justify their reputations. A figure in the morning room at 9:45, he said. That is the whole affair. He had come to see me in London on a pale, restrained morning, when the sky seemed undecided between clarity and mist, and the traffic below my window moved with a respectable weariness. My breakfast things had just been removed. The fire was excellent. Order reigned. It was therefore a bad moment for absurdity, though absurdity, I have observed, rarely consults the calendar of comfort. I invited Hale to sit and waited. He had the look he often wore when approaching a matter he suspected I should find interesting, an expression composed in equal parts of skepticism and professional resignation. He seated himself heavily, produced his notebook, and then, as though to reassure both of us, repeated, "A gentleman seen in the morning room at Ashbourne Hall before 11 o'clock. You put much emphasis, I said, upon the hour. Because everyone at the house does. That, I replied, is the first useful thing you have said." He made a face, ignored the rebuke, and continued. Ashbourne Hall, he told me, was the country seat of Edmund Ashbourne, a widower of means and long-standing local importance. The house was one of those old establishments where custom has outlived explanation and is obeyed partly from reverence, partly from laziness, and partly because no one wishes to be the first to test whether disobedience will provoke scandal, ghosts, or the displeasure of elderly relations. Among its peculiar rules was one regarding the morning room. By long family usage, that room was never used before noon. The curtains remained drawn through the morning. No fire was lit there. No caller was received in it. Even the family, Hale said, spoke of it with a sort of light derision that covered a deeper reluctance. It simply was not done. And yesterday, he went on, at roughly 9:45, a housemaid named Nora passed along the east corridor. She glanced through the partly open door of the morning room and saw a dark figure standing inside by the window. In full light. The curtains were still drawn. So in shadow. Yes, but she swears it was a gentleman, because she says he was tall, dark-coated, and standing as no servant would stand. I inclined my head. The last is the most English form of identification I know. Hale gave a short laugh against his will. She cried out. By the time the butler and a footman came, the room was empty. No one admitted to being there. No one. No stranger could have entered the house. According to the household, impossible, which generally means difficult. Yes, I said, and often only for the innocent. He turned a page. The story spread by luncheon. The servants took fright first, then the family took offense, and by the time I was sent for, the whole place had that atmosphere country houses get when everyone is trying to behave normally in a way no normal person ever does. I asked for the names. Edmund Ashbourne, master of the house, his son Martin Ashbourne, his daughter Miss Clara Ashbourne, their cousin Leonard Vane, who had lately been staying at the house, the butler, Finch, the housekeeper, Mrs. Greeley. No other guests were staying in the house, though a solicitor from London was expected the following day. Ah, I said. A solicitor. Hale shut the notebook. Yes, there it is. So the house expects a change. It expects something. Edmund has been unwell. There is talk of a new will, or an amended one. No one knows exactly, which means, of course, that everyone knows nearly enough to be nervous. Already the thing interested me very much, not because of the room, and not even because of the figure, but because of the hour. If a person wishes to disturb a household, he must not merely appear where he is not expected. He must appear where meaning will attach itself to him at once. A closed room is useful. A forbidden hour is better. Why? I asked. Is the room not used before noon? Hale spread his hands. Family custom. That is not an answer. It is the only one I was given. Then the truth lies underneath it. He looked at me steadily. That is why I came. Good. He had at least understood that much. We went down to Ashbourne Hall that afternoon. The house stood among damp lawns and winter, bare trees dignified without charm. It had the appearance of having survived several periods of English taste and forgiven none of them. The older stone core of it remained visible beneath later additions, and the whole gave the impression of a respectable public face set over something private, stubborn, and perhaps not entirely healed. One sees such things in men also. The butler, Finch, admitted us. He was a tall man of that admirable order of servants who seem less to move through a house than to continue it. His gravity was architectural. He led us across the great hall, where portraits of severe Morvans looked down with the confidence of the well-born dead, and into the library. Edmund Ashbourne received us seated near the fire. Illness had thinned him without diminishing his authority. He was a man a little beyond 60, spare, pale, exact in his person, and very much accustomed to having weaker natures adjust themselves around him. His eyes remained acute, his hands fine and restless, lay on the arms of his chair as if command had retreated there after abandoning the rest of the body. "Mr. Poirot," he said, "I am told you make much of little things." "I make much," I said, "of the right little things." His mouth altered slightly. "Then perhaps you will justify the disturbance this one has caused." He dismissed Hale with a brief nod and spoke to me with more directness than I had expected. No theft had been reported. Nothing in the morning room appeared missing. No one admitted entering it. Yet he did not, I thought, bring me here merely to calm servants' nerves. Underneath his irritation there was expectation. He believed something had begun. "Does the room have some history?" I asked. "All rooms in old houses have history." "Yes, but not all are closed till noon." The custom remained. Why? She preferred it. "That explains her habit," I said, "not the family's obedience to it after her death." He looked at me with the faint displeasure of a man who dislikes being made to continue. "There were circumstances," he said, "old family matters, unpleasant ones." "And are they still unpleasant?" he replied coldly. "If they were not, you would not be here." That was honest. I met the others at tea in the drawing-room. Miss Clara Morvan interested me at once. She was a young woman of composure rather than softness, with dark hair, an intelligent face, and the grave self-possession of one who has long practiced. Not showing more than the situation deserves, in another setting she might have been called proud. In that house, she had probably needed to be. Leonard Morvan, the nephew, had charm of the expensive but unreliable kind. Handsome, easy in manner, quick to smile, he belonged to that class of men who grow agreeable as naturally as others grow serious, and who rely too long on grace when substance would be more useful. Yet there was strain beneath the surface. He laughed too easily and listened too carefully. Mrs. Evelyn Dane was elegant in a faded way, still attractive, still controlled, with the air of a woman who has made a life from gracious dependence and intends to preserve both words of that arrangement. Her companion, Laura Gray, was younger and clearly less at ease in the house. She had the look of one who had learned to be useful because usefulness is safer than visibility. Dr. Stephen Larch was a man of excellent professional manner, calm, deep-voiced, observant, and precisely the kind of physician families trust because he appears to understand them before they have fully explained themselves. That alone is never enough to make me distrust a doctor, but it is quite enough to make me watch him. I introduced myself. They received me politely. Then I said, after the first formalities had exhausted themselves, "I understand that the morning room is not used before noon." The effect was immediate, though subtle. Clara lowered her cup. Leonard smiled. Martin looked down at his saucer. No one else spoke. "My dear Mr. Poirot," said Leonard, "you make it sound sacred. Is it not?" said Edmund sharply from his chair. "It is merely an old custom inflated by servants into melodrama." Clara spoke then for the first time. "It was not the servants who invented the custom." There was a brief silence. Leonard said lightly, "My cousin enjoys giving depth to family oddities. I prefer oddities with explanations." She returned. "Very good," I thought. "There is tension here already, well practiced." After tea, I asked to see the room. Finch took me there. The morning room stood on the east side of the house, opposite a corridor that led toward the smaller staircase and the older bedrooms. It was attractive in a restrained and rather melancholy way: pale wall panels, delicate chairs, a writing desk near the window, shelves of books not recently handled, and a marble mantel above which hung a portrait of a fair woman with a direct, thoughtful gaze. The curtains, now open, admitted a quiet afternoon light that seemed less to fill the room than to reveal how long it had been kept waiting. This is a distinction important in houses. Some rooms are used, some neglected, and some preserved. The preserved room is the most interesting, because preservation is memory disguised as housekeeping. I crossed to the mantel. Beneath the portrait, a brass plate gave the name, Helena Ashbourne. So the aunt. The fireplace was cold. No fire had been laid. The furniture showed no obvious disorder, yet the room did not feel empty. It felt suspended, as if the household had agreed to leave it partly belonging to the dead. On the writing desk stood a silver paper knife, a blotter, and a closed drawer not quite fully shut. I noticed at once that the paper knife had been replaced carelessly. In an otherwise careful room, carelessness is information. "You said nothing was missing," I remarked. "Nothing has been identified as missing, sir," said Finch. "That is a more intelligent statement." He gave no sign of pride, but I think he felt it. I opened the desk drawer. There was note paper, envelopes, sealing wax, and an old leather, bound engagement diary many years out of date. No valuables, no letters, nothing theatrical. Still, a desk in a room never used before noon is already a contradiction, unless once, long ago, the room mattered in affairs of consequence. "Who first entered after the sighting?" I asked. "Myself and Jenkins, the second footman, and the door." "Partly open, sir." "Had it been open earlier?" I could not say. Number, of course, he could not. As I turned from the desk, I saw in the carpet near the hearth the faintest flattening, not recent enough to be conclusive, but enough to suggest someone had indeed stood there, for at least a little while. Not a servant dusting rapidly. A person waiting, listening, perhaps looking toward the door. In the corridor outside, I found Clara. She had not intended, I think, to appear to be waiting, but she was there nevertheless. "You knew I would ask more," she said. "Yes, and you prefer to ask where the walls do not answer back." "Walls always answer," I said, "only not aloud." That seemed to please her, despite herself. We walked a little way along the corridor. "The room was Helena Ashbourne's," she said. "She died before I was born. But in this house her name remains attached to certain habits in a way that is never explained and always felt. She lost something there." Clara looked at me very directly. "She lost certainty." "Through a will." "Yes, there it was, not the whole truth, but the first firm edge of it. She told me then that Helena Ashbourne had once expected to inherit under one arrangement, and then been disappointed under another. Family feeling had been wounded, documents had been disputed, and though nothing scandalous was ever publicly acknowledged, her later life became associated with withdrawal, pride, and peculiar domestic rules. The morning room, once hers, had after her death remained closed until noon because that had become inseparable from the memory of what happened to her. "One generation suffers a humiliation," I said, "and the next preserves the furniture." She gave me a long look. "Yes, that is almost exactly Ashbourne Hall. And now your father consults a solicitor." Her silence was answer enough. "Who stands to gain or lose most by a change?" I asked. She said quietly, "Everyone, in some different way. That was true, and therefore useful. Before dinner, I had a brief conversation with Dr. Larch in the library. He entered while I was examining a shelf of family memoirs and offered me the smooth courtesy of a man who knows that doctors and detectives are always assumed to be rivals in domestic crises. "You do not think much of apparitions, I imagine," he said. "I think a household apparition is usually a person with timing," he smiled. "Then you are ahead of most of the servants. Doctors also appreciate timing. We must." His answer was neutral, but he had watched me too closely while giving it. He was interested not merely in the event, but in how far I had already connected it with the state of Edmund's affairs. Later, over dinner, Leonard performed charm more openly. He spoke lightly of traditions, mocked the sensitivity of old houses, and suggested that the maid had probably seen a curtain shadow and promoted it to masculinity. Yet once, when Finch announced that Mr. Penrose, the solicitor, had telegraphed to confirm his arrival on the morrow, Leonard's hand tightened momentarily on the stem of his glass. That was enough. By the time I retired, the shape of the first chapter of the affair had become clear to me. A room not used before noon because of an old inheritance grievance. A household presently awaiting some movement of a new will. A maid who sees a man standing in that room precisely before 11, when the room's unused state still carries its old force. No theft, no intrusion, no explanation, only disturbance chosen with intelligence. Yais. The room mattered less than the significance someone wished to attach to the hour. If you appear in a corridor, you are seen. If you appear in a forbidden room at a forbidden time, you are interpreted, and interpretation, in family matters, is often the beginning of fear. Chapter 2. Ashbourne Hall. Ashbourne Hall belonged to Edmund Ashbourne, a widower of severe habits and fixed expectations, whose grown children lived beneath his roof without much warmth between them. It was one of those houses in which order had long ago ceased to be merely convenient and become instead a principle of government. Even before one knew anything of its inhabitants, one felt the pressure of regulation in the arrangement of objects, in the silence of the passages, and in the very manner by which doors were opened. Nothing was left to chance, because chance at Ashbourne Hall had evidently been regarded for generations as a vulgar intruder. Inspector Hale had given me the broad facts upon the journey down. But facts described in a railway carriage are one thing, and facts observed in the house that contains them are another. A family, like a room, alters its proportions according to where one stands. The same circumstance that appears trivial in a notebook may in a drawing room reveal itself as central, not because it has grown, but because one at last sees the tensions arranged about it. The house itself stood square and pale against a low sky, its older stone front weathered by time and the discipline of English rain. There were yew hedges clipped into obedience, gravel without a leaf upon it, and windows so tall that they seemed less designed for light than for supervision. A broad sweep of steps led to the entrance, where a pair of urns stood empty and dignified, as though even flowers had been judged too disorderly for the place. Hale, beside me, looked up at it with the expression policemen reserve for houses in which trouble is likely to be highly educated. "You see," he said, "nothing theatrical, a perfectly respectable establishment." "My dear Inspector," I replied, "the most dangerous theatres are often the most respectable." He made his little sound of impatience and led the way inside. The great hall into which we were admitted possessed exactly the quality I had expected: dark wood, family portraits, polished silver upon side tables, and that highly disciplined quiet which does not soothe but warns. The butler, Finch, received us with the grave precision of a man who had long ago decided that emotion was a personal failing. He was tall, spare, and flawlessly correct, with the kind of face on which every muscle appeared to have been trained for service, and then told to remain there permanently. "Mr. Porrow, Inspector Hale, Mr. Ashbourne is expecting you in the library." No surprise, no curiosity, and certainly no warmth. Yet I observed that his hands, though steady, held the salver a shade more firmly than ease required. The household, then, was not indifferent to our arrival. It was merely trying to appear so. We crossed the hall, passed a staircase of dark carved oak, and entered the library, Edmund Ashbourne rose as we were shown in. He was a man a little beyond 60, upright, broad-shouldered, and of an appearance which suggested not old age but persistence. His hair had gone almost entirely silver, though his face retained much of its former hardness. One saw at once that he had built himself upon routine, authority, and a belief in the usefulness of obedience. Widowerhood had not softened him. If anything, it had sharpened the outlines of his nature, leaving behind only command and fatigue. He bowed with correctness. "Mr. Poirot, Inspector." His eyes rested on me with cool assessment. Those of such men always do. They measure first the degree to which one may be managed. "Hale tells me," he said, "that you have an interest in unusual domestic disturbances." "I have an interest," I said, "in disturbances that are arranged to appear domestic." For the first time something like approval flickered, though only for an instant. "Then perhaps you may save us all a good deal of nonsense. I will be plain. My household has become unsettled by a servant's report. I do not like unsettled households." "No," I said, "you would not." He ignored that. "The morning room is by custom unused before noon. Yesterday, at roughly 10:30, my young housemaid declared she saw a man standing inside it. The room was found empty. No one admits to being there. Since then, every corridor in the place seems to carry whispers." "And you believe the sighting false?" "I believe," he said, and his voice grew a degree colder, "that whether it was false or true, it was not accidental." That interested me more than anything else he had yet said. "You expected something of the kind." His fingers tapped once on the edge of the desk. "I expected disturbance. Not this form, perhaps, but disturbance. Because—" he hesitated. "Not long, but long enough to matter. Because certain family questions are under consideration." Hale glanced at me. I said mildly, "Questions often become louder when a will is being rewritten." Mr. Ashbourne's expression did not alter, but his hand stopped tapping. "You are direct. I find it useful." He considered that and then rang for tea. His children entered a few moments later, and with them the atmosphere of the room altered at once. It is always instructive to watch a family assemble before it has had time to remember its chosen expression. Martin Ashbourne came first. He was the elder son, perhaps 35, fair and well-featured, but with that unmistakable air of internal strain which no good tailoring can conceal. He had the look of a man who wishes passionately to do the right thing and is no longer certain what the right thing would be. His manner toward his father was dutiful, but over-careful, toward the rest of the household, guardedly kind. His sister Clara was of another order altogether. She was perhaps 32, dark-haired, self-contained, and possessed of a face in which intelligence and reserve existed in admirable balance. She was not conventionally soft, nor did she attempt to be. Her eyes were clear, observant, and rather too steady for comfort. Of all present, she seemed least inclined to pretend that the matter of the unused room was nonsense. Their cousin Leonard Vane came last. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, easy in movement and well-practiced in charm. One saw at once the type agreeable, adaptable, plausible, and perhaps a little too ready to fit whatever company he found himself in. Such men are often underestimated because their confidence appears casual. In reality, it is usually the result of long exercise. Hale had told me that Leonard had lately come to stay upon some vague business affair. I did not care for vagueness attached to charm. Tea arrived. Finch served it with unshaken gravity. Yet even then I noticed how the room arranged itself around expectation. Martin reached too quickly for his cup. Clara did not touch hers for some minutes. Leonard lounged with the polished ease of a man determined not to look interested. Edmund Ashbourne watched all three of them while pretending to watch none. I said, after a suitable interval, "The morning room has acquired, I think, a degree of importance beyond its practical use." Clara looked up at once. "My dear Mr. Poirot," said Leonard lightly, "that is a very graceful way of saying. The servants have made a drama out of curtains and shadows." "Have they?" He smiled. "In country houses. If one wishes excitement, one must improvise it," Martin said, unexpectedly, and rather sharply. Nora is not fanciful. That was useful too. People defend witnesses when they fear what the witness may truly have seen. And Nora, I asked, is the girl who saw the figure? Yes, said Martin. She is young, but not silly, Clara said coolly. Youth and silliness are not the same thing, nor, for that matter, are confidence and truth. Her brother flushed faintly. Leonard gave a short laugh. There are households in which conversation conceals feeling. There are others in which feeling is the conversation and the actual words are only a costume. Ashbourne Hall belonged to the latter category. After tea I asked to see the servants. Mrs. Greeley, the housekeeper, was a large, composed woman with an expression of controlled concern. She had given 30 years, one understood immediately, to the domestic defense of Ashbourne Hall, and regarded any disturbance as both moral insult and personal inconvenience. She told me that the house ran by rule, that no servant entered the morning room before noon, that Nora had come to her in a state of fright, and that she herself had at first believed the girl mistaken, until, she added reluctantly, she observed how the family had taken the matter. Meaning? Mrs. Greeley smoothed her apron. Meaning, sir, that when a story touches nothing, people dismiss it. When it touches something, they become careful. Who became careful? All of them, she said, after a pause. In different ways. Finch, questioned separately, proved more exact. Yes, the room was customarily shut until noon. Yes, the custom had been observed for as long as he had served. No, he did not know its origin. No, he did not believe Nora invented what she claimed to see. Yet, when I asked him who in the house had reason to use the room without wishing to be seen there, he became very still. That, he said, is not a servant's conclusion to offer. Perhaps not, I agreed. But you have one. He looked at me directly for the first time. In a household governed by habit, sir, one false note is seldom accidental. Very good, the butler possessed intelligence. Elsie, the parlour-maid, had not seen the figure, but had seen Nora almost at once afterward. Her account confirmed fright, not performance. Nora herself was brought to me last. She was a slight girl of perhaps 19, white with the effort to remain composed under so much adult attention. Such witnesses are often unreliable in detail, but truthful in emotion, and it is important not to frighten them into usefulness they do not possess. You saw a man? I asked gently. Yes, sir. In the room itself? Yes, sir, by the fireplace. In full view. The curtains were still mostly drawn, but the door was a little open, and he was there. Did you see his face? No, sir, not proper. Only when I cried out he moved. Like he turned. And then I ran. What made you think him a gentleman? She blinked, surprised that the matter should need explanation. The way he stood, sir. It was exactly as Hale had said. I did not smile. To a servant raised in a house of rigid distinction, posture is as telling as profile. She had seen not a workman, not a footman, not a groom, but someone who occupied space without apology. Was he tall? Yes, sir. Broad? Not broad. Straight? Maybe. Could it have been one of the gentlemen of the house? At that she looked instantly terrified. I couldn't say, sir. Which meant, of course, that it certainly could. When she had gone, Hale gave me his practical little shrug. Well, there we are. A frightened girl, a dim room, and a good deal of family nerves. No, I said. Something more deliberate. We next examined the room itself. The morning room lay on the east side, opposite the blue corridor, and just beyond the smaller staircase. It was pleasant enough in shape, with 2 tall windows overlooking a side lawn, a marble mantel, small bookcases, and light furniture faded elegantly with time. Yet it possessed also that unmistakable quality of preservation rather than use. It was maintained, dusted, and respected, but not lived in. One does not feel in such rooms the recent life of sitting, reading, or conversation. One feels observance. The curtains were now drawn back. The fireplace was cold. A writing desk stood near the window, and on it, I noticed, a silver paper knife lay at a curious angle. Not careless exactly, but not quite restored. On the hearthrug before the mantel, the carpet pile was faintly pressed, as though someone had indeed stood there for more than a passing glance. "Interesting," I murmured. Hale looked. "What is?" "That someone who wished merely to pass through the room chose instead to pause." He made a note of that, though with less faith than obedience. Above the mantel hung a portrait of Helena, Ashbourne, Edmund's late aunt, whose attachment to the room had hardened into family custom. Near it a small ormolu clock had stopped at some point and not been repaired. The effect was delicate and a little sad. Yet I do not trust sadness in old rooms unless I know who arranged it. From the morning room we moved along the corridor and up the smaller staircase. It gave access to the family bedrooms and, more importantly, allowed a person to reach the room privately without crossing the central hall. That was important. Habit governs houses not only by time, but by route. If someone wished to enter the unused room before noon without attracting notice, this stair offered the better chance. When I pointed this out, Hale grunted. "So your gentleman came from upstairs?" Or wished the witness to think so. That evening before dinner, I had a short conversation with Clara Ashbourne in the library. She stood by the window with a book closed in her hand, though she had clearly not been reading. Of all the household, she appeared most willing to face unpleasant logic. "You think the sighting was arranged," she said. "Yes, to frighten us. To instruct you, fear is simply the method." She turned toward me. "And what is the lesson supposed to be? That the house is not as settled as it pretends, that old rules may be broken, that what is closed may be opened." A faint shadow crossed her face. "My father has told you about the will. He has told me just enough to confirm its existence and not enough to be useful." "That sounds like him. Do you expect to gain by it?" She smiled slightly, though there was no amusement in it. In a family such as this, gain and blame are usually distributed together. "An excellent answer." At dinner, Leonard Vane entertained. Martin worried, Clara observed, and Edmund ruled the table by economy of speech. Mrs. Greeley did not appear, of course, nor the servants except in function, yet their knowledge moved invisibly through the room all the same. A household may be outwardly divided by class and inwardly united by apprehension. When at last I retired, I had already formed the first definite conclusion. When a household runs by habit, one false note is seldom accidental. The morning room was not merely a room. It was a family signal preserved across years. Whoever stood there before 11 o'clock understood that perfectly. The figure had been placed not to conceal something, but to awaken something. Memory, fear, suspicion, perhaps guilt. The room itself mattered less than the fact that someone had chosen the one place and hour guaranteed to disturb the balance of the house. And at Ashbourne Hall, I was becoming increasingly certain. Balance was the only thing keeping the family from open conflict. Chapter 3. The morning story. Nora declared that she had passed the east corridor at 9:45 and seen, through the partly open door of the morning room, a dark-coated gentleman standing by the window. That was already a refinement upon the first household version, which had placed the figure later and nearer the mantel. I was not surprised. In large houses, a story changes as it travels. What a maid sees, what she reports, what the butler repeats, and what the family chooses to hear are seldom identical. Fear is a poor editor, but a very rapid one. I therefore asked to speak with Nora alone. She came to me pale but resolute, a slight girl with the strained dignity of one who knows that people above her are deciding whether she is truthful or foolish. Such witnesses are often more reliable in emotion than in detail, and one must handle them with care. "You are certain of the hour?" I asked. "Yes, sir." The quarter had just struck. "How do you know?" "Because cook had sent up the breakfast tray to Mr. Ashbourne not long before, and I heard the clock in the hall." That was good. A remembered hour attached to another household action is much stronger than a bare impression. "And the door was open?" "A little, sir. Only a little." "You looked in because it was open?" "Yes, sir." "What did you see?" "A gentleman by the window in a dark coat, not the fireplace." "No, sir." "By the window. Facing you?" "Not proper. More sideways. As if he was looking out, or listening." That interested me at once. Could you see his face? No, sir. Then why did you think him a gentleman? She seemed genuinely surprised by the question. The way he stood, sir. It was an excellent answer. Servants in old houses become experts in posture. They know how masters stand, how callers wait, and how other servants hesitate at thresholds. Nora may not have seen a face, but she had seen confidence. You did not enter. Oh no, sir. The room was not to be done yet. It is never prepared before noon. No, sir, never. And you assumed the man had been admitted? Yes, sir. I thought perhaps Mr. Finch had let him in private. Only later, when I asked Elsie if there was company, she said there was none. And then the story spread. Yes, sir. When she had gone, I sat for a little in silence. The sighting had not begun as mystery. It had begun as a perfectly ordinary explanation, a caller privately received. Only when the butler denied admitting anyone, and the room's curious status was recalled, had it ripened into unease. That was important. A thing does not become disturbing merely because it is seen. It becomes disturbing because it contradicts what others insist must be true. I went again to the morning room and stood where Nora must have stood in the corridor. The door, left partly open, offered exactly the right frame. A man at the window would appear clearly enough to establish presence, but not identity. The witness would be certain that someone was there, and uncertain who. That balance was too neat to be accidental. Inside, the room still possessed its preserved, almost ceremonial air. The curtains were now open, but one panel bore a faint twist at the cord, as though recently drawn and put back in haste. On the writing desk lay a silver paper knife slightly askew. In a house so ruled by habit, slight disorder often tells more than wreckage. Beside it was a blotter and a sheet of paper so perfectly square that it made me suspect another sheet had been removed only shortly before. Someone had not merely stood there to be seen. Someone had also touched the desk. When I told Inspector Hale so, he looked dissatisfied. You mean the figure was a performance? In part. But if a man wanted papers, why be visible at all? Because visibility directs attention, I said. An unseen intruder provokes search. A seen intruder provokes discussion. Discussion is the better cover. That is one of the oldest methods of deception. Offer the mind something dramatic, and it will neglect the quieter theft beside it. By luncheon, the household had divided itself exactly as I expected. Martin Ashbourne believed Nora because he wished truth to remain simple. Clara believed the act deliberate because she was too intelligent to accept simplicity. Leonard Vane laughed at the whole matter with just enough ease to suggest effort. Edmund Ashbourne dismissed it as nonsense, yet did so with the particular irritation of a man who fears nonsense may be useful to someone else. The story, therefore, had hardened at once into a question: who had been there, and why was it useful for others to believe he had been there at that hour? I arranged the facts. Nora saw a figure, probably real, at 9:45. The figure stood where it could be seen, but not identified. The room chosen was one the household associated with prohibition and old memory. No caller had been formally admitted, no family member admitted using it. Yet the curtains had been touched and the desk disturbed. So the intruder understood the house. He knew the room was sensitive. He knew the hour would magnify alarm. He knew a servant passing the corridor might carry the sighting at once to the rest of the staff. Most likely, he relied upon precisely that. The figure in the morning room was not the mystery, it was the announcement of one. Chapter 4. Breakfast habits I have always preferred. In questions of mystery, to begin where vanity does not think to hide itself. At the breakfast table, people prepare their lies for the library, the drawing room, the formal interview, and the late-night confession. They are much less careful when reaching for toast, asking for more coffee, or opening letters before they have properly arranged their faces. Habit is the natural enemy of invention. At breakfast, one sees not what people wish to appear, but what they have long practiced being. Ashbourne Hall, like most houses governed by rule, had reduced the first hours of the day to a system almost liturgical in its precision. Edmund Ashbourne took tea and dry toast at 8 exactly in his study, Not a minute earlier, not a minute later, Martin breakfasted at 8:30 and did so quickly, often before going to the stables. Clara preferred coffee in the library. With fruit and bread she scarcely seemed to touch. Leonard Vane came down last, with the air of a man personally wronged by all hours before 10 and fully prepared to say so, if the eggs had suffered in consequence. The servants moved in equally settled pattern. Trays were carried up, silver cleared, coal laid, letters sorted, bells answered, fires examined, and the side corridor windows opened in their proper order. In houses like Ashbourne Hall, routine does not merely support life. It conceals, frames, and occasionally betrays it. I therefore asked Finch for a precise account of the previous morning. He received the request with that butler's expression which combines obedience, reserve, and a strong private suspicion that the world would be easier to manage if gentlemen asked fewer questions about domestic detail. Mr. Ashbourne had his tray at 8, as usual, he said. Tea, dry toast, and the first post, if any, had arrived. Mr. Martin breakfasted in the dining room at 8:30. Miss Clara took coffee in the library shortly after. Mr. Vane did not ring until nearly 10. Who took Mr. Ashbourne's tray? Nora carried it to the study door, sir. I took in the letters later. Latter meaning about 8:20. That interested me at once. Nora, then, had already been near the study before seeing the figure in the morning room. And the letters? I asked. Were there many? 3, sir. One for Mr. Ashbourne, one for Mr. Vane, and a circular. No letter for Miss Ashbourne. No, sir. Or for Mr. Martin. No, sir. Finch paused, then added, a messenger had also come from the village with a note for the stables that was handed to Mr. Martin at breakfast. From whom? The farrier, I believe. I made a little nod. Small facts often appear in the disguise of useful irrelevancies. Next I asked for the exact servant movements between 8 and 10. Finch, who had either an excellent memory or an excellent respect for order, provided them with almost military neatness. Mrs. Greeley had inspected the upstairs linen press at 8:15. Elsie, the parlour maid, had been in the dining room clearing away after Martin. Nora had gone up with the breakfast tray, then returned, then later taken dusters toward the blue corridor. A footman had laid coal in the smoking room. The post had been sorted in the butler's pantry. At 10:05 Leonard rang from his room for hot water, though it had already been sent once. Mr. Vane rang twice, I asked. Yes, sir. That suggests either discomfort or distraction. Finch allowed himself the shadow of an expression. Mr. Vane is not a gentleman who wears routine naturally. Excellent. A servant's mild disapproval is one of the finest instruments of social measurement. I watched breakfast. The following morning, not openly, of course. One need not sit at table to observe how a household begins its day. One has only to place oneself intelligently in corridors and doorways, and to know which sounds belong to settled habit and which do not. At 8 precisely, Edmund Ashbourne's tray passed up the smaller stair. At 8:10, a bell sounded from the study. Finch went in with the letters. At 8:20, he emerged with an empty cup and a face so perfectly blank that I became certain something in the correspondence had interested his master, not enough to disturb visible control, but enough to tighten it. Martin came to breakfast at 8:30 exactly as I had been told. He ate quickly, scarcely tasting anything, and read the note brought from the stables twice before folding it into his pocket. A man who works with horses may breakfast quickly from habit. A man who reads the same line twice is preoccupied. He left at 8:40 with the step of one going not merely to duty, but to uncertainty. Clara entered the library at about the same time with her coffee. Through the open door I saw her pause before taking up a book, not to read, but to look toward the window in thought. She seemed to me a woman living in active inward attention, which is always dangerous to those around her if they prefer comfortable lies. Leonard did not appear until nearly 10. His lateness, his complaint about the eggs, and his easy ill temper all matched the butler's description perfectly. Yet I noticed something else. He asked, almost at once, and too casually, whether the post had come, Finch answered that it had. Leonard said, "Nothing urgent, I hope," in a tone meant for lightness and too carefully made light. That was the first time I became certain he was waiting for something. Breakfast habits are invaluable because they reveal the natural lines along which the morning moves. Once those lines are established, one can see more clearly where a person had the opportunity to step outside them. Nora, after carrying the tray and before taking dusters upstairs, had a clear interval. Martin, between leaving breakfast and reaching the stables, had a route that could have taken him past the east corridor. Clara, in the library, might have gone unseen to the morning room had she wished, though I did not think she had. Leonard, still upstairs at the relevant time, could easily have used the smaller stair and then returned to his room before ringing for hot water. Edmund, though less likely, was not physically prevented from entering the room if he had left his study. But opportunity alone is never enough. Opportunity is the most democratic element in crime. It belongs to everyone. The more revealing question was this: who understood that the breakfast hour would hide movement better than any evening disturbance? The answer, almost certainly, was someone long familiar with the machinery of the house. From such ordinary movements, more truth may be gathered than from any number of dramatic declarations. At Ashbourne Hall, the morning had its own strict map. If a figure appeared in the unused room at 9:45, it was not because chance placed him there. It was because he knew precisely who would be occupied, who would be absent, and who, passing with dusters, would carry the sighting like a lit taper through the house. In other words, the intruder had not merely entered the morning room, he had used breakfast itself as cover. Chapter 5. The planned encounter. By comparing the testimony of kitchen, pantry, and corridor, I found that from 9:40 until 10 exactly the passage outside the morning room was briefly unobserved. It was the one moment in the morning when Ashbourne Hall, for all its devotion to regulation, loosened its own vigilance. Finch carried letters to Edmund Ashbourne's study. Elsie was occupied in the breakfast room with trays and silver. Mrs. Greeley supervised the still room below stairs, where supervision was her chief idea of civilization. Nora, not yet, dispatched with dusters, remained elsewhere. For 20 minutes, perhaps a little less, the east corridor lay open in a way it never did at any other hour. That discovery altered the whole character of the affair. Until then, everyone in the house had spoken, openly or by implication, as though the figure in the morning room represented an intrusion, some mysterious entry into a forbidden place at a forbidden hour. But an intrusion is generally clumsy. It risks being seen at the wrong moment by the wrong person. What I saw instead was a convenience so exact that it could hardly be accidental. A person who knew the house thoroughly could enter the unused room during that unobserved interval, wait there in safety, and receive another person without the least fear of interruption. The room had not been chosen merely because it was not used before noon. It had been chosen because, for those few minutes, it was private. What had been called a ghostly appearance was, in truth, the perfect arrangement for a meeting meant to leave behind only rumor. I reconstructed it in my mind. At some point between 9:40 and 10, one person entered the morning room by the east corridor, or, more probably, by the smaller staircase that gave discreet access from the upper floor. He did not light a fire. He did not fully open the curtains. He stood where he might later be seen but not recognized. A second person either joined him there or was already waiting. They spoke briefly, perhaps exchanged something, perhaps only words. Then one departed unseen. The other remained just long enough to be observed by Nora when she came along the passage. That last detail was the key. If secrecy alone had been desired, both parties would have left before any servant passed the door, but one remained to be seen. Therefore, the sighting was not a mishap. It was part of the design. The meeting was private. The impression of unexplained presence was public. Whoever arranged it wished not only to confer unseen, but to ensure that the house afterwards talked of the wrong thing. When I put this to Inspector Hale, he stared at me with the expression of a man who suspects his case has ceased to belong to him in quite the way he had expected. "So you think there were two people?" "I think there may well have been two," I said. "At least one entered in order to wait. The room's usefulness lies not in concealment alone, but in controlled discovery. Why would anyone wish to leave behind a rumor?" For the oldest reason in domestic strategy, I said. To direct attention toward appearance and away from purpose. He grunted. Meaning that if the family spends the day asking who was seen in the room, it is less likely to ask what passed between the people who met there, or what changed hands. He did not enjoy the logic, which is not the same thing as failing to understand it. I therefore returned to the movements of the household with greater precision. Martin Ashbourne breakfasted at 8:30, received a note from the stables, and went out shortly afterward. That route did not naturally take him near the east corridor, though he could have passed it if he wished. Clara remained in the library with coffee and a book she scarcely appeared to read. Leonard Vane, according to Finch, remained upstairs until nearly 10, when he rang again for hot water, with the impatient insistence of a man too aware of time. Edmund Ashbourne received letters in his study. The servants followed their appointed patterns. It was all on the surface, exactly what one expects from a well-run country house. But surface is a very democratic thing. Everyone possesses one. I questioned Finch again, this time with greater attention to sequence. When you carried the letters to Mr. Ashbourne, I asked, how long were you in the study? A few minutes, sir. Long enough for someone to pass through the hall without your seeing. Yes, sir. Long enough for someone descending the smaller staircase to reach the morning room. Yes, sir. Did you hear movement in the east corridor? No, sir. But the study door was closed. Quite. Servants often think they are giving very little when they admit only possibility. In reality, possibility is the gate through which the whole case frequently walks. I then asked to speak with Nora once more, but very gently and without the inspector. When you looked into the room, I said, did it seem to you that the gentleman had been alone for long? She frowned. I don't know, sir. Did you hear anything before you looked? She thought for several moments, anxious not to say too much and equally anxious not to say too little. I thought, she said at last, as if someone had just stopped speaking. Not a full voice. No, sir, only as if there'd been a murmur, maybe, and then nothing. That was enough. One must not ask too much of a young witness. If pressed, she would either retreat or invent. But this small impression was exactly what I had expected. She had not heard two people clearly. She had sensed the end of conversation. The silence in the room had not been natural. It had been newly made, so a meeting. The question became at once not merely who had been there, but why the meeting had been arranged in so strange a fashion. For secrecy alone, there were simpler methods in a house like Ashbourne Hall. One might walk in the shrubbery, speak in the stables, meet in the library when others were dressing, exchange notes by servant or by book. To choose the morning room at that precise hour suggested not merely the desire for privacy, but the desire to make privacy itself part of the later effect. Simonon wanted the house unsettled. Simonon wished the forbidden room, the wrong hour, and the sighted figure to ring in the minds of the household all day long, like a bell too lightly struck to be silenced and too distinctly heard to be ignored. This, in turn, brought me back to motive. At Ashbourne Hall, what topic already lay nearest the surface? Not romance, not theft, not illness. The answer, though no one had yet confessed it outright, was inheritance. A solicitor was expected. Edmund Ashbourne had lately become more secretive in correspondence. Clara had admitted as much by not denying it. Leonard had shown too ready an interest in the post. Martin was anxious. The servants were alert. In such an atmosphere, a meeting in a room associated with old household custom and perhaps old disappointment could scarcely fail to suggest one thing: the disturbance of settled expectations. In other words, if a man wished to frighten his relations without making a direct accusation, he could hardly have found a better instrument. I began to look then not only at who could have arranged the meeting, but at who would profit from the household, feeling itself observed, destabilized, and ripe for suspicion. Martin, though nervous, seemed too transparent in his alarm. He feared consequences, certainly, but I did not yet believe him the author of so theatrical a device. Clara possessed intelligence enough, but her nature struck me as too direct for this particular method. She might expose. She would not hint. Leonard Vane, however, had both charm and indirection, and charm in men is often merely indirection made socially acceptable. Still, I was not yet prepared to settle on him. There remained Edmund Ashbourne himself. It is always dangerous to exclude the master of the house simply because he appears least likely to stoop to his own disturbance. Prideful men sometimes arrange exactly such scenes in order to test loyalty, frighten dependence, or prepare the ground for a future announcement. Yet something in Edmund's irritation seemed genuine. He was not pleased by the form the thing had taken. No, I thought. The signal had been aimed at him as much as through him. That afternoon I examined the physical routes again. From the smaller staircase, one could descend to the east corridor and enter the morning room without being visible from the hall. From the side passage near the old schoolroom, one might also approach it indirectly. The windows looked upon the side lawn, but from outside, with the curtains mostly drawn. No clear sight inward was possible. The room was therefore useful in precisely one way, for those within the house and familiar with its rhythms. A household mystery, then never trust any other kind until forced. As I stood there, measuring the angle from corridor to doorway once again, Clara Ashbourne came quietly along the passage. "You have found something," she said. "Yes." The room was used for a meeting. She did not phrase it as a question that impressed me. "What makes you think so?" I asked. "Because fear spreads too efficiently here, when no one has instructed it to." This was instructed. "Excellent," I said. "Who in the house would choose to communicate by disturbance rather than by speech?" She considered. "Someone who wanted to force everyone else into uncertainty." Which is not an answer. It is the only honest one I can yet give. That too was honest. Then, after a moment, she added, "If the meeting concerned my father's will, it may not have been intended to frighten him alone. No number in this house. Any movement of money or position alters every relation around it. Martin worries because he cannot help worrying. Leonard pretends not to care because caring would show dependence. I dislike suspense less than most, but I do not enjoy being managed by it." "Very good," I said. "You have named the essential atmosphere." She looked toward the closed door of the morning room. "Do you think something was handed over?" "Yes, or something was asked for. Papers, possibly." That word affected her, only slightly, but enough. So papers mattered to Clara, too. When she had gone, I remained for some time reflecting on a principle the police too often neglect in family affairs. The visible disturbance is rarely the act itself. It is the advertisement of the act, or its disguise. What mattered was not that Nora had seen a gentleman where none ought to be. What mattered was that she had seen him at exactly the point when a rumor, born from the sighting, would travel fastest and most usefully through the house. This was not haunting. It was timing. By dinner, the effect of that timing had deepened exactly as its author, whoever he was, must have intended conversation at table, moved with forced normality. Martin was quieter than before. Leonard was more amusing than before. Edmund was more severe. Clara watched. The servants moved with the rigid care of those pretending not to know that everyone above them knows they know, and under all of it ran the same unspoken calculation: who had met whom and why. I had not yet answered the question, but I knew now that it was the right one. The figure in the morning room had not come there to frighten a maid. He had come to meet someone under cover of the house's own habits, and to leave behind, once the meeting was over, exactly enough uncertainty to cloud whatever had actually passed between them. That is not the work of a ghost. It is the work of intelligence disciplined by familiarity. And when such intelligence is at work within a family already waiting upon a will, one may be certain of this much. The meeting in the morning room was only the beginning. Chapter 6. The missing paper that afternoon. Edmund Ashbourne discovered that a document was missing from his study desk, a revised will, unsigned but complete, prepared only the day before. Until that moment, the figure in the morning room had remained, in the minds of several persons at Ashbourne Hall, something half absurd and half theatrical, a disturbance, yes, but one still capable of being classed among those domestic alarms which thrive briefly upon uncertainty and then perish under daylight. A servant had seen a man. The room had been used at the wrong hour. The family had become uneasy. All this might still, to practical minds, be reduced to nerves, misunderstanding, or some private folly. The missing will altered everything. It is one thing to see a figure where none should be. It is another to learn, within the same day, that the master of the house has been deprived of the very document by which he intended to rearrange the future of everyone beneath his roof. At once the morning, room visitor ceased to be a curiosity and became, unmistakably, a person connected to motive. The discovery occurred in the library shortly after 4 o'clock. Edmund Ashbourne sent for Hale and myself with a brevity that already suggested anger too tightly controlled to be mistaken for anything else. When we entered, he stood by the writing table, one hand laid flat upon the leather blotter, the other holding open a shallow drawer with a kind of restrained violence, more expressive than any raised voice would have been. "It is gone," he said. "What is gone?" asked Hale. "The revised will." That answer silenced the room more effectively than any dramatic pause could have done. Finch, who had admitted us and was still near the door, did not move an eyelash. But his stillness deepened. Clara, who had followed us in from the corridor, became suddenly very pale. Martin, arriving almost at the same moment from the yard entrance, stopped short as though a physical obstacle had been placed before him. Leonard Vane, a second later, and with less excuse for presence, masked surprise with an effort just too visible to my eye. Edmund Ashbourne turned to the desk again. "It was here," he said, "in the inner compartment beneath the correspondence tray. I placed it there myself last night after reviewing it. This afternoon, when I intended to look over one clause before Mr. Penrose arrives tomorrow, it was missing." "You are certain," I said, "that it was not removed to some other drawer?" He gave me a cold look. "I am not in the habit of mislaying testamentary documents in my own study." "No," I said, "you are not." That answer, being agreeable to his self-respect, allowed him to continue. The revised will, it appeared, had been drafted in London and brought down the previous day by confidential messenger. It had not yet been signed, and therefore had not yet superseded the existing testament. Nevertheless, it was complete in all material particulars. Edmund had intended to review it privately and execute it after one final conversation with his solicitor. Now it had vanished. Hale, whose instincts immediately improved now that paper rather than atmosphere was involved, asked practical questions. Who knew of its existence? Where exactly had it been kept? Was the desk locked? Who had access to the study? Edmund answered in the curt manner of a man whose indignation does not make him less exact. Yes, the drawer had been locked. The key was usually kept on his watch chain. This morning, however, during dressing, he had left it briefly upon the mantel. No servant had been authorized to touch the desk. His children knew he was revising his will, though not, he said with hard emphasis, its terms. Leonard knew a solicitor was expected. Finch may have guessed as much. The servants certainly did not know the document was already in the house. "Unless," murmured Clara, "somebody saw the messenger arrive." No one answered that. It was too plausible to dismiss. I asked, then the question that mattered more than any other: who would have suffered by the new provisions? At that the family tension which had until then remained diffused took shape. Edmund did not reply at once. His gaze moved, not by chance, from Martin to Leonard, and then to Clara. Each bore it differently. Martin colored, and then went white. Leonard looked down, adjusted his cuff, and smiled faintly with lips only. Clara's face remained still, but her eyes did not leave her father's. "So," I said softly, "more than one." He answered with reluctance. "But not evasion. The revised will alter the future of the estate in a manner unwelcome to several members of the family. Martin Ashbourne, though still provided for, would no longer enjoy the expectation of direct management." Edmund had grown dissatisfied with what he called his son's want of decision. and proposed instead that the property be placed under a board of trustees for a period of years. Martin's position would become that of beneficiary, not master in training. Martin made a movement almost involuntary. "You told me none of this," he said. "I told you nothing because I choose my own affairs to disclose," said Edmund. That, I thought, was entirely in character and very poor policy. Leonard Vane, cousin and house guest, had long been living under the expectation, never perhaps formally secured, but distinctly encouraged, that Edmund Ashbourne would assist him out of his present financial difficulties. The new will reduced that promised rescue to a much smaller annuity, payable only under conditions and not immediately. Leonard's eyes lifted at this point, not with outrage but with a kind of rueful alertness, as if he recognized that pretense of ignorance had become useless. "And Clara?" I asked. Edmund's expression hardened again. Clara's present allowance would continue, but the new settlement tied the principle of certain property into trust. She would not, as under the former arrangement, enjoy independent control of it. In other words, Clara would lose precisely that freedom which often means more to intelligent women than comfort itself. No one spoke for several moments. Then Martin said, in a low, strained voice, "You plan to distrust all of us at once." Edmund replied, "I plan to preserve the estate from incompetence, dependence, and impulse." "One must admire," said Leonard lightly, "the economy with which we have each been insulted." "Be quiet," said Clara. He obeyed, though with a glance at her that was worth remembering. The missing will had now transformed the whole landscape of the case. The visitor in the morning room was no longer some symbolic trespasser, stirring up old custom for amusement or vague intimidation. The visitor had almost certainly been connected to a practical design. He, or the person seen as him, had used the room and the hour to conceal an encounter related directly to the document, now gone from the study desk. The logic was plain. Somebody knew, or strongly suspected, that the revised will was in the house. Somebody also knew the rhythms of the morning well enough to arrange a brief private meeting during the only safe interval. And afterward, by leaving behind the impression of an unexplained presence, that same person ensured the household would talk first of the impropriety of the room, not of the paper that may have changed hands. I turned to Hale. "The desk," I said, "must be examined at once. Not for fingerprints. This is a family house, not a railway carriage, but for method. A thief of papers is rarely as tidy as he supposes." Hale nodded and bent at once to the drawer and lock. I meanwhile looked not at the desk but at the room. The study was large, masculine, and heavily ordered. Books in sober bindings, maps, estate plans, account ledgers, and the usual grave furniture of landed certainty lined the walls. The writing table stood not far from the fire, placed to command both door and window. It was the room of a man who wished control to feel natural, yet at that moment all that careful order had acquired the slight but unmistakable air of having failed. Upon the blotter, I noticed a faint displacement where papers had recently been stacked and removed. Beside the inkstand lay the correspondence tray Edmund had mentioned. Under it, when lifted, the leather surface showed the ghost of a rectangular impression. The will had indeed lain there until not long ago. More interesting still, the inner drawer lock bore no sign of force. It had been opened properly. "With the key," said Hale. "Or by someone skilled enough to make it appear so," I answered. But I did not think that second explanation likely in family thefts. Convenience usually prevails over expertise. A key left briefly unattended is temptation enough for most people. I asked Edmund, "When did you last see the document?" "Last night after dinner." "And when did you first discover it missing?" "Half an hour ago." "Then there is a broad interval, too broad, unless we narrow it by opportunity." Opportunity, however, was already beginning to sort itself. Martin had been out much of the morning, but not all of it. Clara had free access to the library wing. Leonard, as a guest moving with the privileges of kin, could come and go with little notice. Finch entered the study in service. The other servants did so rarely. Yet the theft of a will is not usually a servant's crime, unless servants expect to profit by inheritance, and English servants, whatever else may be said of them, seldom indulge that fantasy. Number the motive lay upstairs, not below. I asked, Who among you knew enough of the will's contents to be alarmed before today? At that there came the expected chorus of partial denials. Martin knew only that changes were intended. Leonard knew nothing precise, merely that Edmund had lately become uncomfortably thoughtful. Clara admitted that her father had told her, some days earlier, that he contemplated new trusts and limitations, though not the exact form they would take. Leonard declared with graceful bitterness that his own needs had perhaps led everyone unfairly to imagine him guided by money. Martin protested that he would not steal from his father. Clara said nothing at all. Silence from Clara was more interesting than defense from the men. When the others had at last dispersed, reluctantly, and only after Hale had warned them that no one was to leave the house or grounds without informing him, I remained in the study with Edmund Ashbourne. "You do not seem surprised," I said. He gave me an angry look. "I am furious." "Yes, but not surprised." For the first time he hesitated with something like honesty. "No," he said at last, "not entirely. Because you expected the will to offend. I expected resentment. I did not expect theft." "Resentment," I said, "is often only theft without courage." That earned me nothing, but it was true. He then admitted what he had not wished to say before the others. He had allowed hints of the new arrangement to circulate intentionally. He believed, it seemed, that by doing so he might observe the character of those dependent on him. It was the old aristocratic error, mistaking the deliberate creation of strain for a test of moral quality. "In other words," I said, "you laid bait." His expression darkened. "I informed no one of details." "But you informed them that details existed. That is often enough." So now at last the matter stood clear. A revised will, unsigned but complete, had been in the study. More than one member of the family had reason to dislike its provisions. The morning room had offered, during a brief, unobserved interval, the ideal place for a secret conference. The sighting there had diverted attention into rumor, and by afternoon the document itself had vanished. Now the morning room visitor ceased to be a curiosity. He became, unmistakably, a person connected to motive. And once motive enters a household mystery, imagination becomes unnecessary. One has only to watch who is most anxious to keep the matter theatrical. Chapter 7. The false visitor. The household had assumed the stranger was a man because Nora had glimpsed a dark sleeve, broad shoulders, and a hat upon the chair. That assumption had spread through Ashbourne Hall with remarkable speed and almost no resistance. By luncheon it was no longer a figure in the morning room, nor Summony seen through the half-open door, but a gentleman, dark, coated, private, unexplained, and therefore perfectly suited to the anxieties of a family already prepared to suspect intrigue. It is one of the small weaknesses of intelligent households that they are often too ready to supply sophistication to uncertainty. Give them the least encouragement, and they will elevate a silhouette into intention. Yet Nora had seen only what she was ready to see. That was the point from which I began. A witness, especially one of lower rank in a great house, does not look at an ambiguous figure as a painter looks, patiently, without conclusion. She looks as a servant must always look, swiftly, usefully, and with the instinctive social classification on which domestic order depends: tall or short, family or servant, male or female, permission or impropriety. Nora's glance had lasted perhaps a second, perhaps two. In dim light, with the curtains still partly drawn and the door only slightly open, she had perceived not a person, but an impression. The house, by that time already ripe with expectancy over the will, had done the rest. I returned to the morning room just before dusk, when the failing light most nearly resembled the conditions under which Nora must have seen the figure. Hale came with me, though he wore the air of a man convinced that nuance was being used upon him like a medical instrument. "You mean to prove she imagined it?" "No," I said. "I mean to prove she imagined correctly in the wrong direction." The room, once more partially curtained, yielded itself at once to experiment. I placed a dark hat upon the carved chair near the window, one borrowed, with some reluctance, from Leonard Vane's collection of unnecessary refinements, and then stood first within the room, then outside in the corridor, exactly where Nora said she had paused. The effect was immediate. A dark outline by the window, the hat upon the chair back, the angle of the door, the uncertainty of the light. Yes, it was entirely sufficient. Even a cautious observer would have taken the figure for masculine, if the figure wished to be taken so. I then removed the hat and asked Hale to stand in the room with his back half turned. Seen from the corridor, he appeared not as a man, but as a position, shoulders, sleeve, darkness, authority. When I replaced him with Mrs. Greeley, secured after some argument and with an expression of strong moral disapproval, the illusion was not much altered. A woman standing straight, with a dark garment falling in simple line, may easily read as male when one sees only outline. "There," I said softly. Nora saw not a gentleman. She saw a silhouette accompanied by a suggestion. Hale folded his arms. "And you think the suggestion was arranged?" "I am becoming certain of it." What had first made me suspect as much was not the witness, but the room. If a man had truly met another there in the ordinary sense implied by the household, some private caller, some secret masculine visitor, he must have left behind certain ordinary masculine traces, unless he were made of vapor or trained by monasteries. The weather that morning had been damp enough that outdoor shoes, though not muddy, would likely have carried some residue onto the floor near the sill or hearthrug. A man forced to wait even a short time in privacy often turns instinctively to tobacco. A gentleman caller, especially one admitted in secrecy, tends to bring with him the faint debris of gendered habit. Yet the room offered none of those signs. There was no trace of mud or damp soil at the entrance, none near the hearth, none by the window where the figure had supposedly stood. The carpet pile remained undisturbed, except for the faint flattening I had already noticed before the desk. And near the chair the grate held no new ash, and certainly none of cigar or cigarette. The air, though still and enclosed, did not retain even the ghost of tobacco. Instead, when I bent near the chair and the curtain edge, I detected something else. It was faint, but distinct enough once one ceased, expecting cigar smoke, and began permitting the room to answer. Honestly, a dry floral perfume, restrained, elegant, and cool rather than sweet. I had noticed it once already elsewhere in the house, not in the drawing room, where Evelyn Dane used something softer, nor near Laura Gray, who wore no scent at all. But when Clara Ashbourne had passed me in the library on the first afternoon, perfume is one of those clues which must be handled with delicacy. It is not evidence in the vulgar sense. It is association sharpened by memory. Yet in an enclosed room associations matter. I stood still and allowed recollection to order itself. Yes, the same scent. Not common, not strong, but individual enough to attach itself to a person of fixed taste. I turned to Hale. "Did you notice Miss Ashbourne's perfume?" He gave me a look of professional injury. My attention is not usually directed that way. "A pity," I said. "It saves time." I crossed then to the carved chair itself. It stood a little aside from the window, with a high back and ornamental carving at the crest. Earlier I had observed nothing beyond its usefulness in supporting the hat that completed the illusion. Now, looking more closely along the edge where wood met upholstery, I found caught in the carving a broken thread of black silk. I drew it free very carefully. Not wool, not cotton, not the coarse black of servant wear. Silk, fine and smooth, from a garment of better quality, torn perhaps on the carved detail as someone turned quickly. It was too slight a thing to speak by itself, yet added to the perfume, to the absence of male traces, to the artificial hat, and to the visual experiment, it became highly eloquent. The male visitor had been no gentleman caller at all. He had been a deliberate impression designed by a woman. That conclusion did not yet answer the whole question. It narrowed it. The difficulty in house mysteries lies not only in discovering what happened, but in resisting the temptation to jump too quickly from what happened to who did it. The perfume pointed toward Clara. Yes. The black silk would suit her dress of that morning. Certainly. But intelligence requires patience, and women's garments in houses of mourning colors and winter fabrics are often less distinct than men imagine. Evelyn Dane also wore dark clothing. Laura Gray had at least one black silk mourning dress, though plainer. Even a servant's gown, under extraordinary circumstances, might produce a deceptive thread if trimmed unusually. Yet the perfume remained the most individual sign, and the hat upon the chair device had about it something very like Clara's mind, direct in aim, subtle in execution, contemptuous of theatrical excess, except where useful. I therefore sought conversation rather than accusation. Clara was in the library, where she had again arranged herself with a book she had no intention of reading. When I entered, she looked up with that level steadiness which had increasingly marked her out from the others. "You have found something," she said. But I saw that she understood at once the direction in which I had come. "You no longer think the figure was a man." A pause followed. Then she said, "Because there was no tobacco, among other reasons." She gave a faint, almost unwilling smile. "How very like a detective." "How very like a woman," I answered. "To know which of the reasons you should name first." That checked the smile, but not entirely. I drew the black silk thread from my pocket and laid it upon the table between us. This was caught on the carved chair. She looked at it, not with surprise, never that, but with a kind of measured fatigue. And the room retained your perfume." Clara's gaze lifted to mine. "You are sure of that? As sure as one should be before dinner and before proof. That is a very careful sentence." "I am a careful man." For several moments she said nothing. Then, quite quietly, "If I ask whether you have told the others, will you consider that a confession? Number only intelligence." She rose and moved to the window, where the fading light from the lawn behind the house outlined her profile. When she spoke again, her voice had altered. It was not pleading, not yet defensive, but stripped of the outer social control in which she usually clothed it. "You think I meant to steal the will. I think you meant the household to believe a man had used the room. That is not the same thing." She turned. "And if I say I designed the impression but did not take the paper, then I shall believe it possible." That answer surprised her more than accusation would have done. The truth emerged not all at once, but in sections. Yes, she had been in the room. Yes, she had arranged to be seen as masculine if a servant happened to glance in. The hat had been Leonard's, taken earlier from the stand in the side passage. She had chosen the room because she knew precisely what effect the hour and place would have. Once Nora saw her and cried out, Clara decided to let the household believe in an unexplained male visitor, knowing that such a rumor would draw suspicion away from the true object of concern, the missing will. "Why?" I asked. "Because I wished to meet someone privately without the household guessing." "Whom? Whom did you meet?" She hesitated. "Martin." That was not. At first, the answer I had expected, yet, the instant she gave it, several tensions in the household rearranged themselves. I had already taken the will from my father's study and gone to the morning room to think. I intended to remain there only a few moments. "So you created a false male visitor?" "Yes. It was clever. It was also reckless. Why not meet in the library, or in the shrubbery, or write a note? Because Leonard prowls, because my father watches everyone at table and in corridors, because Martin is incapable of stealth when agitated, because I needed a place no one would think a sister and brother would choose deliberately. Yet you ensured that someone might see." Her expression tightened. "Not exactly. I knew the passage would be empty. I did not count on Nora, but once I heard her cry out, I realized the mistake might yet serve." There, then, was the moral shape of Clara's action. She had not created the sighting from the beginning solely to spread rumor. She had created the possibility of misidentification as protection for the meeting. When the sighting occurred, she had chosen not to correct it because the falsehood was useful. "Did Martin come?" "Yes." "Did he remain long?" "A minute." Perhaps, too, he was frightened and foolish. He wanted me to persuade my father not to strip him of control of the estate. I told him I could do nothing, unless we first knew exactly what the will contained. He left by the smaller stair. And afterward, I remained only long enough to decide whether Nora had really seen me. Then I straightened the paper on the desk, replaced the hat, and went out by the corridor. You touched the desk. Yes, but only because the paper knife had fallen. That at least matched what I had observed. Did you take the will from your father's study? Number it came without ornament. And I believed her, not because she was incapable. On the contrary, Clara had the intelligence for theft if driven to it. But her action in the morning room had been indirect, strategic, defensive. The theft of the will required a different order of nerve, a choice not merely to unsettle the household, but to convert that disturbance into practical gain. Clara had used the room as cover for family conference. Someone else, understanding or seizing the opportunity it created, had taken the document. In this way, one wrongdoing had overlapped another. The false visitor was hers. The missing paper was not. When I told Hale, he was profoundly dissatisfied. Policemen dislike divided culpability. They prefer a single hand, a single motive, a single clean narrative from start to finish. So Miss Ashbourne created the scene, but did not steal the will. Exactly. That is inconvenient. Yes, I said, truth often is. By evening the case had sharpened considerably. The apparent male intruder had dissolved into a woman's calculated silhouette. Clara had met Martin privately, meaning to disguise the meeting and then choosing to profit from the misunderstanding when it arose. The room's mystery was therefore partly false, yet the theft remained real. The will was still gone, and because the household had spent the crucial hours discussing a mysterious gentleman, the true thief had enjoyed precisely what such people most require: confusion. The false visitor, in other words, had not committed the central crime. She had only made it easier. Chapter 8. Clara's arrangement when pressed. Clara admitted that she had been in the morning room at 10 o'clock, but claimed she had gone there only to meet Leonard Vane, who wished to warn her that Martin meant to challenge their father over money. It was a neat explanation. Indeed, it was a little too neat, and for that reason I distrusted it at once. A falsehood, to be serviceable in a family house, must satisfy not only the facts already known, but also the emotional habits of those expected to hear it. Clara's account did this very cleverly. It acknowledged presence without surrendering motive. It introduced Leonard, whose temperament and financial dependence made private conversation plausible. It invoked Martin, whose anxiety had become increasingly visible and whose relation with his father could easily be imagined at the point of strain. Above all, it preserved Clara's dignity by presenting her not as an intriguer, but as a sister drawn reluctantly into other people's disorder. Very elegant. Too elegant. He had asked to speak with her alone, but even in private she answered with the composure of a woman who had long practiced saying no more than she intended. We were in the library. The lamps had been lit. Outside, the long winter dusk pressed against the windows, and the room, with its dark shelves and controlled firelight, seemed made for confidences that wished at the same time not to be confidences at all. "You were in the morning room," I said. "Yes, at 10 o'clock. Approximately, and you arranged to be taken for a man." A pause then. I arranged not to be clearly identified. That was better and more truthful. Why? She folded her hands in her lap. Because I wished to speak privately. With Leonard Vane. Yes, you are certain of that. I have just said so. Words, I replied, are most useful when they are not asked to carry more than they can bear. Her eyes lifted to mine. You think I lie? I think you are telling me only the part of the truth you consider survivable. That touched her, though outwardly she scarcely moved. Piece by piece, under patient questioning, the account emerged as follows. Leonard, she said, had sought a private interview that morning. He had intimated the evening before that Martin was in growing agitation over their father's financial intentions, and might do something reckless if not warned or restrained. Clara, who did not wholly trust Leonard, but trusted open family conflict even less, had agreed to meet him briefly before the household settled into its usual late morning order. She chose the morning room because no one used it and because it afforded, at that hour, a short interval of privacy. "Why not the library?" I asked. "Because my father uses it." The garden, too visible from the south windows, the old schoolroom, too near the servants' stairs, the conservatory. She gave me the faintest look of impatience. "Mr. Poirot, if one is to meet privately in Ashbourne Hall, one must first account for the habits of 6 servants. One father, one nervous brother, and one cousin who appears from nowhere when not wanted. I chose the one place no one naturally enters before noon." That, at least, was wholly credible. It was not the place that troubled me. It was the additional layer of contrivance. "You did more than choose privacy," I said. "You arranged to leave behind the suggestion of an unknown outsider." Her expression became still again. "I see no reason to deny that now," she said. Once Nora had cried out, the thing had already become impossible to explain simply. I preferred the household to think first of some private caller rather than of me. Yes, but the hat on the chair, the position by the window, the profile to the door, those were not an afterthought. They were prepared. At that she did not answer. Silence, in such moments, is frequently a confession with dignity preserved. "It would have been enough," I went on gently, "to meet Mr. Vane unseen. Yet you arranged from the start for the possibility that, if seen, you would be misread. Therefore secrecy was not your only concern. You wished also to create a certain kind of later stories." She turned her head toward the fire. "Suppose I did. What then?" "Then I ask, why the story of a stranger mattered to you more than the stranger himself?" That question, I think, struck nearer the center than any previous one, for she gave no immediate answer. Instead she rose, crossed to the mantel, and stood looking not at me but at the old framed photograph there of Edmund Ashbourne in younger, sterner days. When she spoke, her voice had altered slightly, not weakened. No, Clara was not of the sort to weaken under pressure, but stripped of some outer polish. "You do not understand this house yet," she said. "A private conversation between cousin and cousin would be remembered by dinner and interpreted before dessert. A mysterious male visitor would at least scatter interpretation in several directions." "Excellent," I said. "Now we approach the truth." She looked back at me sharply. "Truth is not always improved by being approached." "No," I said, "but it is often improved by being less arranged." At last she admitted the essential point. The meeting had been planned in such a way that, if observed, it should produce not one clear explanation, but many competing ones. She wanted uncertainty. She wanted the house looking outward, toward some imagined caller, some male interference, some external pressure. In that atmosphere, the actual purpose of the meeting, whatever it was, would be hidden among speculation. That explained presence. It did not explain why Leonard was named, for by then I had already begun to suspect that Leonard Vane had not been in the house at all at the relevant time. This suspicion arose from a very small thing. When first I asked Finch whether Leonard had breakfasted before or after 10, the butler had said that Mr. Vane came down late, as usual, and had complained if the eggs were not hot. Yet when I pressed upon the exact minute at which he was first seen downstairs that morning, Finch's certainty lessened. He had heard Leonard ring. He had not, however, actually laid eyes upon him until somewhat later. That distinction, minor in itself, became useful when combined with a separate fact from the servant's entrance. A bicycle tire mark in the damp gravel, fresh enough to suggest recent movement that morning, and not belonging to any regular estate messenger. I therefore sent Hale to the village. He returned in less than 2 hours with the answer. Leonard Vane, at the relevant time, had been in the post office. He was remembered there by 2 clerks and the delivery boy. He had arrived shortly before 10, posted 2 letters, made some complaint about the delay in receiving a telegram, and remained long enough to be certainly absent from Ashbourne Hall, when Clara claimed to have met him in the morning room. That destroyed her account entirely. Not part of it, not merely the emotional color, the whole thing. When I pressed her further, later and in the presence of Hale, she did not betray herself vulgarly. She did not cry out, protest innocence in high phrases, or accuse the post office of conspiracy. She simply grew quiet in a new way. The silence of a person who understands that the form she built has failed and must either be abandoned or replaced. Clara's face lost a little color. Hale, who enjoys these moments more than he ought, said bluntly, "Who was in the room with you?" She turned to him with visible distaste. "You need not shout. I am not deaf." "Then answer." I intervened. "Let us first remove one error, Miss Ashbourne. You did not arrange that meeting because you needed Leonard. You arranged it because you needed the story of a stranger." Her eyes came back to mine. "Yes," she said at last, "that is true." Now that the false pretext had been stripped away, the thing itself began to show its shape more clearly. She had not chosen the morning room only because it was unused, nor even only because it was private. She had chosen it because any disturbance there before noon would resonate through the whole house in a way no ordinary meeting could. A stranger in the morning room at that hour would at once imply intrusion, secrecy, irregularity, perhaps even threat. It would force everyone at Ashbourne Hall into the posture she wanted most. Uncertainty, and uncertainty, properly distributed, is a form of cover. She had needed the cover because whatever passed, or was meant to pass, in that room could not safely be associated with her alone. The household therefore had spent a day speaking of a non-existent male visitor because Clara had judged correctly that such a rumor would be more useful than truth. The room, the half-drawn curtains, the hat, the side, on silhouette, the convenient glimpse through the door, all of it was stage management of a highly intelligent kind. "Why?" I said again. This time she did answer. "Because if the house believed someone from outside had entered, then whatever was later found missing would be attributed outward before it was looked for inward." There it was. Not yet a confession to theft, but something much more valuable, the precise logic of the deception. She had not necessarily stolen the will, but she had anticipated that something might vanish, or that something already had, and wished suspicion at once to flow toward an external male presence, rather than among the family. Hale said sharply, "So you expected the paper to be taken?" "No," she said. "I expected confusion. There is a difference." "Not enough of one," he muttered. But I was thinking quickly now, and not in the direction he meant. If Clara required the story of a stranger more than the stranger himself, then the true importance of the morning. Room scene lay not in the meeting, but in its after-effect. It was a false origin point. She wanted the day's narrative to begin with the figure. Then, when the will was found missing, everyone would already possess a ready-made external suspect. The idea of an intruder would be available before the theft was even known. That was foresight of a dangerous kind. Yet foresight is not always guilt. Sometimes it is merely intelligence badly used in panic. I studied her face. She was frightened now, though not as the guilty are frightened when the trap closes. Her fear was more complicated. It contained calculation still, but also resentment, and beneath resentment, something very like injury. Clara was hiding something. Yes, but I no longer believed it was as simple as theft for personal gain. She had arranged the false visitor because she needed to disorder the household's understanding of the morning. Whether she had done so to protect herself, her brother, or someone else remained uncertain. Leonard, meanwhile, became more interesting through absence than he ever had through presence. Why had she chosen him as the named companion of the meeting? Because he was already plausible in the role of needy intriguer, because his financial dependence made him a convenient villain, because if questioned later, the family would easily believe that Leonard might seek clandestine discussions over the will. In short, she selected him not because he had been there, but because he was socially useful. That was cruel, but it was also intelligent. Thus the chapter closed in my mind with considerably less simplicity and much more truth. Clara had used a room no one entered before noon. At an hour everyone would later discuss, because she needed the story of a stranger more than any ordinary explanation. The false visitor had not been the event, he had been the alibi in advance.
Chapter 9. The real object she had entered. Edmund Ashbourne's study earlier under the excuse of returning a book, seen the new will among his papers, and taken it before she could lose her nerve. The false visitor came afterward. That was the truth Clara gave me at last, and when she gave it she did so not with collapse, but with that grave and deliberate honesty which sometimes appears only when all useful arrangements have failed. There are confessions made from fear, from exhaustion, from vanity, and from a strange desire to be admired for candor after deceit has become impossible. Clara's belonged to none of these. She spoke because the shape of the matter had narrowed to the point at which any further denial would merely vulgarize what she had done. It was late, the lamps in the library had been lit, and the room had acquired that enclosed stillness in which the truth, once admitted, seems at once more dangerous and more orderly. Hale stood by the mantel with a notebook he no longer much needed. I remained near the writing table. Clara sat upright, her hands folded, her face pale but entirely controlled. One might almost have believed her calm had one not seen how carefully it was maintained. "You took the will," I said. "Yes." Hale gave a sharp breath that was very nearly a triumph, but I raised a hand slightly and he remained silent. "From your father's study?" "Yes." "Before the incident in the morning room?" "Yes." It was important to establish that sequence first. The false visitor had not produced the theft. The theft had produced the false visitor. This distinction lay at the very center of the case. "Tell it from the beginning," I said. She did not resist. Indeed, I think she had already resisted as long as her nature could bear. That morning, shortly after Edmund Ashbourne had finished with his first letters and before the servants resumed their ordinary movement through the hall, Clara had gone to the study carrying a book. She claimed to have finished and meant to return to one of the lower shelves. It was the kind of explanation, no father questions in a daughter long accustomed to moving through his library, and Edmund, absorbed in correspondence, and not expecting scrutiny from within his own household, had dismissed her with little attention. But in placing the book upon the side table near the desk, she had seen the document. Not the title, not at first, but the arrangement. A typed set of closely clipped pages laid apart from ordinary correspondence, weighted beneath the silver tray. Marked in Edmund's hand at 2 points with blue pencil. She had seen the word testamentary in the first line and below her own name among the later clauses. That was enough to alter curiosity into certainty. She waited until her father crossed to the window to consult an estate map, slid the top page outward, and in the brief seconds available grasped the essential facts. Martin was to be reduced to dependence. She said quietly, Leonard to be bought off with conditions: the house, the land, the principal revenues. Everything bound in trust. I was to remain here as a beneficiary, not an owner. Comfortable, watched, and permanent. That final word she gave with bitterness, not directed at wealth, but at enclosure. "You were shocked," I said. "Yes, but not surprised." That, too, was clear enough. Edmund Ashbourne was exactly the type of man to call control prudence and administration morality. I had suspected changes. Clara continued. I had not imagined the extent of them. My father intended to preserve the estate by making children of us all. Hale said abruptly, "That still does not give you the right to steal." She turned her head and looked at him with marked distaste. It gives me motive. Do try to distinguish the two." I intervened before irritation could break the structure of her account. "You took the paper then and there?" "Yes." "How?" "It lay loosely beneath the tray, he had not yet sealed it away. I folded it beneath the book cover and left with it." There was something almost chilling in the simplicity of that act. One imagines thefts as requiring art, disguise. Stealth prolonged over time. In family houses they often consist only of nerve applied for 6 seconds in a room where trust still exists. And afterward. I went to my room, I read it fully. Then I understood that if I merely hid it, the search would begin inward at once. Exactly, that was where her intelligence had become strategy. The theft of a will, within a family points first, inevitably, toward the family. No outsider has motive fine enough, no servant usually dares. No wandering villain intrudes to steal an unsigned testament he cannot easily use. Clara knew that if the paper simply vanished, every eye would turn inward, to Martin, to Leonard, to herself. There would be accusation, pressure, locked tempers. Scrutiny, she needed. Therefore, not merely to delay discovery, but to alter the direction in which suspicion would naturally flow. So she invented the visitor. Not wholly from imagination. The idea had suggested itself, she said. The instant Nora later surprised her in the morning room under circumstances she had at first intended only for concealment. She had gone there after taking the will because the room was unused before noon and gave her a place to think. There she had seen, by a kind of cold clarity, that the room itself might provide what she required. A story already loaded with impropriety, privacy and half-believed menace. It came to me all at once, she said. If someone were seen there, not clearly, merely enough, then the theft, when discovered, would have a direction already waiting for it. A direction outward, I said. Yes, toward a blackmailer. A private caller. A stranger connected with your father's affairs. All of those if possible. The household, in other words, would be offered a more convenient villain than any of themselves. That was the true sophistication of her plan. She did not need to define the intruder. She needed only to make him possible. Once possible, he would expand under domestic speculation into whatever the listeners most feared, some unnamed solicitor's agent, some clandestine messenger. Some blackmailer, with knowledge of family tensions. The half-seen man in the morning room would become a receptacle into which everyone poured his own suspicion. And the hat? I asked. I borrowed one of Leonard's from the side stand. That, too, was calculated cruelty. Leonard's style made such an accessory credible in the room, while his financial embarrassments made him an ideal person to be privately suspected without immediate challenge. The dark sleeve, the posture, the place by the window, those were deliberate. Yes, and Nora. I did not count on Nora specifically, but I knew some servant might pass if the timing drifted. Once I heard her cry out, I understood the thing had succeeded better than I intended. That was perhaps the most terrible part of it morally, though not legally. What began as a concealment became, in the moment of discovery, a deliberate exploitation of another person's honest alarm. Hale, still dissatisfied with any account that included intelligence, said. And you expected us all to chase shadows while you sat here innocent? Clara replied, I expected the house to do what houses always do, prefer a stranger to an explanation. It was difficult to disagree. Yet motive remained to be understood in its proper proportion. Clara had stolen the will, yes, but not, I thought, from greed in the vulgar sense. She had not taken it to enrich herself crudely, nor even to destroy her father's wishes permanently. The thing was more complex, and for that reason more dangerous. You did not steal it for money, I said. Number for freedom, then. Her expression altered, not much, enough. My father believes in permanence, she said. He would call it protection. He meant Martin to live forever under trustees because he mistrusts his judgment. He meant Leonard to be kept dependent because he mistrusts his appetites, and he meant me to remain here, provided for and contained, because he mistrusts independence when it belongs to a woman. The will would have bound us all into his opinion of us. And you yourself would be trapped between one man's weakness and another man's opportunism. At that she gave a little movement of the head. Exactly. The moral position had therefore become clear. Clara saw herself not as thief, but as temporary saboteur in the service of delay. She did not mean, perhaps, to destroy the will permanently. She meant to prevent its immediate execution, to force reconsideration. To buy time, and, in buying time, to preserve what she imagined remained possible of choice. This did not excuse her. It explained her. The distinction matters. She had stolen the document. I said to Hale, though still looking at Clara, to force delay. And invented the visitor, he said. Understanding at last, to give the house a more convenient villain. Yes, it was precisely that. Convenient villains are the foundation of many domestic tragedies. Families prefer them because they spare affection, vanity, and hierarchy from direct collision. If a stranger may be blamed, then one need not ask how deeply mistrust already lived at home. Clara had counted on that instinct, and rightly. Where is the will now? I asked. In the linen press above the old schoolroom, she said. Wrapped in brown paper inside the blue hat box.
Hale moved at once, but I stopped him. It will still be there. He looked irritated. How do you know? Because if she had meant to destroy it, she would not have troubled with so elaborate a substitute for theft. Delay requires preservation. Clara said quietly. Yes, the will was recovered exactly where she said it would be. When Hale brought it back down and laid it upon the library table, the entire day's unease seemed at once to alter in quality. What had been rumor became event. What had been the household drama of a stranger's sighting became the much more intimate scandal of internal defiance. Edmund Ashbourne, when informed, received the news not with loud anger, but with a silence so severe that even Hale was made uneasy by it. He sent for Clara at once. I considered advising against an immediate confrontation, but refrained. In family matters, the truth is rarely improved by staging, and they were already far beyond comfort. The interview between father and daughter took place in the study with only myself present. Hale remained outside. Edmund stood by the desk from which the will had vanished and to which it had now returned. Clara entered with composure. For some moments, neither spoke. The resemblance between them, the same controlled mouth, the same resistance to wasteful feeling, struck me forcibly then. They had injured one another, in the same language. "You took it," Edmund said at last. "Yes, and fabricated the rest." "Yes." He looked at the recovered document, then at her. "Why?" She answered without tremor. "Because you were about to arrange our futures as though we were defects in an estate plan. You presume much." "Number, I read exactly." His face changed, though only slightly. "You had no right." "No," she said, "but you had no right either to make prisoners of us and call it prudence." That was the nearest either came to violence. Neither raised the voice. Yet the force between them was such that a shout would only have diminished it. At length Edmund said, "You have always preferred opposition to gratitude." Clara answered, "You have always preferred control to trust." I do not think either spoke wholly justly. That is the tragedy of these scenes. Truth appears, but never alone. It drags old wounds, old pride, and old misreadings behind it. When she had gone, Edmund remained standing by the desk for a long time. At last he said, not to me exactly but into the room itself, "She thinks I wish to trap her." "Yes," I said. "And did I?" That was not a question to be answered cheaply. "You wished," I said carefully, "to prevent disorder." He gave a dry, weary sound, which is another way of saying, "I wish to decide for everyone." "Yes," he nodded once, as if at a judgment he had long postponed hearing. By then the essential shape of the affair was plain. Clara had entered the study under innocent pretext, seen the revised will, and taken it before courage failed. But theft alone would have pointed inward, toward the family, where motive already waited. So she created the legend of a visitor in the morning room, hoping suspicion would drift outward toward some unnamed blackmailer, solicitor's agent, or private emissary. Her purpose was not greed in the vulgar sense. She believed, rightly or wrongly, that her father's new arrangements would render Martin helpless, Leonard dependent and predatory, and herself condemned to permanent management. She stole the will to force delay, and invented the visitor to provide the house with a villain more convenient than truth. That should have ended the case. Yet, I was not satisfied, for there remained still one element not fully accounted for. The true purpose of the meeting Clara had wanted hidden. Delay explained the theft. It did not wholly explain the private conference, nor did it explain the look I had once seen pass between Martin and Leonard when the will's disappearance was first announced, nor the peculiar eagerness with which Leonard had allowed himself to be socially useful as an absent suspect. A family mystery rarely closes at the point where one confession makes everyone else comfortable. And Ashbourne Hall, I felt more strongly than ever, was not yet ready for comfort. Chapter 10. Idle rooms. The will was recovered from behind the false bottom of Clara's writing case, and the scandal was contained with less noise than the household had feared. That, perhaps, was the most Ashbourne conclusion possible. No servant's gossip carried beyond the back stairs. No constable was required to tramp officially through the study. No magistrate was troubled. The document, unsigned but intact, returned to its proper place. The false visitor dissolved. The household resumed its forms with that peculiar English determination by which a family, having looked for one intolerable hour directly at itself, proceeds the next morning to ask for marmalade, as though revelation were merely a temporary draught. Yet it would be a mistake to suppose that nothing had changed. Cases of this kind do not end in the dramatic simplicity the public prefers. No murderer was led away, no hidden body lay under the floorboards. No long, lost heir burst in from the colonies, with proofs in a leather case. Instead, what had been exposed was something at once smaller and more difficult. the private economy of mistrust, by which a respectable household had lived for years. Clara had stolen the will. Yes, she had also staged the appearance of a mysterious male visitor in the morning room, so that the theft, when discovered, would not at once point inward. She had counted on the habits of the house, on Nora's quick, frightened glance, on the suggestive power of a half-open door and a hat upon a chair. She had used not force, but interpretation. And because she had understood the house perfectly, it had nearly worked. The recovery itself was simple once Clara admitted where she had hidden it. Hale, with an impatience he made little effort to conceal, wished at once to search her room formally and have the thing done. I advised something quieter. A daughter who steals a testament from a father's desk is not likely to thrust it under a mattress like a melodramatic governess in a circulating novel. She will choose a place both private and near at hand, somewhere accessible, respectable, and above all, ordinary enough not to attract the first wave of suspicion. He asked to see her room. It was a room precisely in keeping with Clara Ashbourne herself, orderly without softness, elegant without display, and marked by a restraint more revealing than decoration would have been. There were books, well chosen and actually read. A writing table stood near the window. No photographs occupied it except one small framed likeness of her mother, placed not prominently but where a seated person might see it without offering it to visitors. The bed was neatly made, the curtains properly drawn, and the dressing things arranged with almost severe exactness. Such rooms often mislead careless investigators. They appear too disciplined to conceal improvised wrongdoing. In fact, they are ideal for it, because their very order discourages clumsy search. The writing case upon the side table was the natural hiding place once Clara told us where to look. It was a good piece of leather, old enough to suggest long use, with compartments fitted to paper, envelopes, sealing wax, and notebooks. Clara had told us, after her admission, where the will was hidden, but before she spoke fully I had already suspected that if she retained the document anywhere in her own room it would be there. Writing cases are the natural hiding places of people who think in paper. There was, as it happened, a false bottom, not a recent contrivance, nor one made for crime, but an old craftsman's convenience in the case design itself, just deep enough to hold folded pages, just narrow enough to escape notice, unless one knew to press at the leather lip beneath the correspondence flap. Edmund, with a face carved by equal parts anger and humiliation, drew out the will himself. He said nothing at first. Clara, standing by the fireplace, watched him without movement. I have rarely seen a more painful silence. At last he said, "You might have burned it." "Yes," she answered. "I might have, but you did not." "Number why?" She replied, "Because I wanted delay, not destruction." It was the same truth she had already given me, but it sounded different when spoken to him, less argumentative, more naked. One saw then that, for all her calculation, she had not acted from chaos. She had acted from a hard and deeply reasoned fear of what his arrangement would make. Of all their lives, Edmund, Ashbourne replaced the will upon the desk, as if it had suddenly grown heavier. He did not hand her to the law. Perhaps pride restrained him, perhaps prudence, perhaps age had taught him at last that tyranny in a father may breed deception in a daughter just as reliably as indulgence breeds selfishness in a son. Or perhaps more simply, he understood that to bring police and public scandal fully upon her would be to confess before the county what his own household already knew, that authority at Ashbourne Hall had ceased to command trust. Whatever the reason, he chose family over prosecution. Hale, who accepted the decision with the resigned expression of a man aware that justice in great houses is often administered first by upholstery and lineage, asked only that the matter be recorded privately in case later trouble arose. Edmund agreed. Clara offered no thanks, which was wise. Gratitude at such a moment would have been either hypocrisy or surrender, and she was guilty of neither. Martin, when he learned the truth entire, reacted with distress rather than anger. That did not surprise me. He was one of those men to whom emotional conflict is more exhausting than physical labor. He loved his sister, feared his father, mistrusted Leonard, and felt himself unequal to the estate that was forever being discussed as his burden or inheritance. For such a nature, the revelation that Clara had acted partly in dread of what his weakness might cause was almost unbearable. "I never asked her to do this," he said to me later in the hall. "No," I replied. "That is obvious. Yet she did it because of me. She did it because of all of you. Including herself, families are not arithmetic, Mr. Martin. One does not divide guilt and concern into tidy shares." He looked genuinely miserable. "My father thinks me incapable." "And do you?" That silenced him. It is astonishing how rarely people ask themselves the central question until someone else voices it aloud. Leonard Vane preserved his ease longer than I had expected, but not indefinitely. Once Clara's use of his hat and his convenient absence from the house were made plain, he became first amused, then annoyed, then faintly wounded in that polished male vanity which forgives debt more easily than ridicule. He would, I think, have preferred to be genuinely suspected. It is flattering to be cast as a dangerous man, to be used as a decorative villain, and then dismissed is another matter. "My dear Poirot," he said to me with a smile, too polished to be sincere, "I seem to have served the purpose of a theatrical property." "Yes," I said, "a very expensive one." He laughed. But the laugh did not endure. Men like Leonard rely on being seen clearly enough to charm, and not clearly enough to judge. Clara had understood that, and exploited it mercilessly. Mrs. Greeley resumed command below stairs, almost with relief. Finch resumed silence, which in him was a way of restoring order. Nora, poor child, was never told the whole truth. She was informed only that she had been mistaken in supposing the figure a stranger and that no danger had entered the house. This she accepted with the bewildered obedience of youth, though I think she retained forever after a sharpened distrust of half-open doors. The house itself settled quickly. That is another lesson the inexperienced often fail to grasp. Great houses do not retain visible agitation for long. Their dignity depends upon swallowing disturbance and presenting by dinner an exterior nearly identical to that of breakfast. But what is swallowed is not always digested. It remains. That evening, after the will had been restored and the immediate crisis closed, Edmund Ashbourne asked me to remain a little longer in the library. He had dismissed Hale for the moment, and stood by the fire with an attitude at once more weary and more human than any he had yet permitted himself before me. "You believe I caused this?" he said. "Yes," I answered. He accepted the answer without visible resentment, which told me more about the effect of the day than any show of temper would have done. "I did not teach her dishonesty. Number, you taught her that the only effective resistance to you must be indirect." He looked down. "That is nearly the same thing," he said after a long pause. "Nearly," I agreed. What followed was not confession exactly, nor apology. He was not built for either. But he spoke, with more honesty than before, of his fear for the estate, of Martin's uncertainty, of Leonard's dependency, and of Clara's dangerous self-sufficiency. He had sought, he said, to preserve continuity. He had not intended to create rebellion. "Continuity," I said, "is often the word used when one wishes to govern the future without trusting the people who must live in it." He gave me then a tired, almost unwilling half-smile. Before I left the following morning, Inspector Hale asked the question I had expected from him since the matter first took shape. "How did you know," he said, "not only that Miss Ashbourne was involved, but that the whole mystery turned on arrangement rather than intrusion?" We stood near the front steps while the car was brought round. The sky was pale and clear, the lawn silvered with weak morning light. Ashbourne Hall behind us looked once more composed, as though no room within it had ever been used for deceit, and no will had ever vanished from its master's desk. "I knew," I said, "because idle rooms are ideal stages for purposeful meetings, but only to those who understand exactly when they are idle." He frowned a little. Hale always preferred an answer in the shape of a key rather than a principle. "The clue was the household routine," I continued. "A stranger cannot easily exploit a custom unless he has first studied it, but a family member can. The room was useful not because it was mysterious, but because it was predictably empty. Once one sees that, the rest follows." The sighting was meant to create a story. The story was meant to direct suspicion. Therefore, the real object must lie elsewhere. Yes, he nodded. And the figure being a woman. That came later. There were no male traces in the room, only female ones. More importantly, the witness described not a man, but an impression of one. Hale reflected on that, and then gave his little grunt of acceptance. The mystery, then, was never who entered the morning room. No, I said. It was who wished everyone else to believe that the hour itself meant something extraordinary. That, in the end, is the crucial distinction in many investigations. People do not merely commit acts. They stage meanings. They rely upon the tendencies of others, their fears, assumptions, and social habits to complete the deception for them. Clara did not need a stranger. She needed only the suggestion of one. The household, anxious over money and inheritance, supplied the rest at once. Thus the empty room, the wrong hour, and the half-seen figure became not fact, but theatre. And once a case becomes theatre, the detective's task is not merely to ask what happened. It is to ask who wrote the scene. As the car turned down the drive, and Ashbourne Hall receded behind clipped yews and winter trees, I reflected that I had seen, in essence, no more than an old domestic truth dressed in a slightly cleverer costume. Families do not collapse under great shocks half so often as they deform under prolonged arrangements. Under habits of silence, control, dependence, and fear, a stolen will is only paper. The real theft had been trust, and that had been going on at Ashbourne Hall for years. The morning room would, no doubt, return to its old custom. The curtains would remain drawn till noon. The servants would speak less openly of what had occurred. Edmund might sign or revise the will. Clara might remain under his roof, though not in the same inward relation to it. Martin would continue to struggle with expectation. Leonard would continue to wear charm like a waistcoat and hope it passed for solvency. Outwardly, very little would change. Outwardly, but an idle room, once used for purpose, is never wholly idle again.